All right, everyone. Welcome to Satsang this evening, and glad to have everybody in the house. Diane just jumped in, so I'm happy to see that. That's a really nice thing. And so everybody is assembled and ready to go. Tonight's going to be fun. As I said earlier, before everybody got in here, I found my first mistranslation or typo, so we'll get to see that in the chapter tonight. That'll be a lot of fun. So. Um, What's interesting about tonight is it's a very simple awareness and consciousness. And when you first read this particular chapter, it's very short, less than 2 pages. You're gonna, at first glance, you think, "Wow, that's really straightforward and simple." So, which is nice. But then, as you read it, there's some pieces in here that, if you pay attention to it, that are really pretty interesting. And it actually starts out with in the very beginning when he talks about awareness and consciousness, because the questioner is like most of us dividing states. So he's basically creating states. So there's going to be, the state of sleep, the state of deep sleep, the state of dreaming, and the state of being awake. Those are all going to form different places. And so that's how the questions start. He says, what do you do? What do you do when asleep? He says, well, Maharaj says, I'm aware of being asleep. He said, is not sleep a state of unconsciousness? He says, yes, I'm aware of being unconscious. So pay attention to that, because in the beginning, you get a little confused here. He said, and when awake or dreaming, he says, I'm aware of being awake or dreaming. He said, I don't catch you. Exactly what do you mean? Let me make my terms clear. So now he's going to clear this up for Maharaj because he thinks he's confused. He says, by being asleep, I mean unconscious. By being awake, I mean conscious. By dreaming, I mean being conscious of one's mind, but not of surroundings. And Maharaj comes in and says, well, it's about the same for me. He said, yet there seems to be a difference. In each state, you forget the other two. He said, while to me, there is but one state of being. He said, including and transcending the three mental states of waking, dreaming, and sleeping. So note what he does there. He's now tied all of that in. So why is that, right? So he's describing the state of awakening, right? The awakening piece is that of pure awareness that's always in play. Because remember, when we identify ourselves as I am, Alan or Michael or Jaya, whatever. Oh, by the way, Nick's name is Jaya. I will call her that, so don't worry about her little label there. And so, um, but nonetheless, uh, when you look at that, we're identifying that, but that obfuscates or obstructs the awareness that's there. Now, there's some interesting things, and we'll continue in. He said, the world is but a reflection. He says, do you see in the world a direction and purpose? This is probably one of the coolest little paragraphs you'll ever find. He said, the world is but a reflection of my imagination. He says, whatever I want to see, I can see. But why should I invent patterns of creation, evolution, and destruction? I don't need them, right? The world is in me. The world is myself. And here's the first little typo. He says, I am afraid of it. It should be, I am not afraid of it.
It says that in my book, not afraid.
Is it not afraid in yours? Oh, good. So
Yeah.
someone picked it up. I thought I was, I was like, wow. So I am not afraid of it and have no desire to lock it up in a mental picture, right? So notice what happens is that the seeing of yourself as a concept or a story, right? It is, um, that's the bondage. And he's pointing that out, right? He's in that one paragraph, he's pointing out, I live without the bondage, right? That's what he's after. Now, he's not claiming that he created that. As you know, that happens all by itself, but he's pointing out that that's the natural state. So interesting. I always love the next question after a huge nugget of wisdom is dropped because usually the listener doesn't on the fly. I don't know who's going to get that paragraph, to be honest with you. He says, coming back to sleep, do you dream? Right? Because he says, of course. He goes, what are your dreams? He goes, echoes of the waking state. And your deep sleep, the brain consciousness is suspended. Are you then unconscious? He goes, not quite unconscious. I am aware that I am unconscious. He goes, you use the words aware and conscious. Are they not the same? So here's something for anybody who's working with, it's actually principally, I think, Nisargadatta and Ramesh and those in kind of that world, because the idea of consciousness a lot of times gets split into two pieces. It's going to be consciousness at rest and consciousness in action.
Yeah.
And so awareness never gets brought into play. For just remember, whenever you're reading it, you're working with anything that's Nisargadatta bound, awareness is the pure awareness, and consciousness is consciousness in action. It's always going to be the reflection. That's what it's always that, and it gives them, that kind of ease. It's kind of like the I. Remember the I and you, how Ramana would go I and then have I, right? Because in that language they didn't have kind of the luxury of how English is. So English gets rid of that, but no problem there. All right, let's go on to awareness. He says awareness is primordial. It is the original state, beginningless, endless, uncaused, unsupported, without parts, without change. Consciousness is on contact, right? So remember that consciousness is because all of this one bleeds into the other. So whenever you're dealing with this, you run into these kind of division and boundary lines that actually in lived arising, there's no boundary lines, right? But there is in this. So just note that. So consciousness is on contact, a reflection against surface, a state of duality. Then he goes on to say, there can be no consciousness without awareness. So you see you go to great lengths to divide the two, but then you have to reconnect them, right? Because one bleeds into the other. He said awareness is absolute, consciousness is relative, right? So within the relative, guess what? Some of the absolute bleeds in there, right? Because that's its source. Um, it relative to its content. Consciousness is always of something. He said consciousness is partial and changeful, awareness is total. Changeless, calm, and silent. And it is the common matrix of every experience. So you see, he's bled it into duality. Experiences of normally we would say experiences of duality, and that awareness is source or the absolute. That would be that piece. Now, part of there's one little thing here that's kind of interesting, which is whenever you speak to someone, one of the biggest problems is that, and you tell them that life is basically just a reflection of consciousness. All it is this world that's doing all of that, right? And the minute that someone hears that, they say there's something wrong here, right? It doesn't feel so transitory to me. It feels real, right? It's got solidity, it's got tangibility. That's what that is what someone is typically going to be likely responding when they listen to that kind of thing. But remember where that comes from is the fact that there is awareness in all of that arising, right? So it's very difficult for someone to go, oh, I'm just going to I get it. It's transitory, not happening. It's illusion and all the rest of it. Well, it is illusion, right? But it has some of the glue in it. right? And that's the glue that makes it really hard to understand that kind of a pointer. That's one of the things that's part of the step over. So just recognize that when you see that that's part and parcel of it, you can see why it is one would be swayed to grasp, very, very heartily at the arising because there's a lifetime of arising and that lifetime of arising feels important. It has a sense to it. Well, there's presence involved, right? Presence is simply an extension of the absolute
Yeah.
or,
I,
or,
I,
or awareness.
I feel like I'd like to say something here.
Go ahead. Jump in anytime.
I often think of the external world as being incredibly compelling and realistic and durable, and yet what it arises from is way beyond that. And that durability and compellingness, that sense of that, comes from the awareness that subsists underneath. And so that's
Absolutely.
why it gets mixed up, man.
Yeah. But remember, that's a tough nuance in the beginning,
Oh
right?
man,
Because when we listen to this thing, we want to divide things up into more absolute places, right?
make
So
it makes it more portable and less
yeah,
undefinable.
so the majority of I always remember that story about the frogs and the butter, right? And they're swimming around in the butter, and one of them dies, and the other one's actually it becomes butter, and he crawls out, he hops out. Well, I think recognition is that there is a bleeding into,
Yeah.
reality that when you discuss it, you divide those into those compartments. But life isn't necessarily happening that way. So there is a justification for
Man.
feeling the importance, if you will, or that stability in what's arising. It arises from source. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it arises from the everlasting and the real. So there's a bleeding of that in there. So just recognize that, right?
Yeah. Wow.
So he goes in and he talks about that. He says, so how does one go beyond consciousness and into awareness,
Oh,
right? And he says, since it is awareness that makes consciousness
yeah.
possible, there is awareness in every state of consciousness. Therefore, the very consciousness of being conscious is already a movement in awareness, right? Interest in your stream of consciousness takes you to awareness. It is not a new state. It is at once recognized as the original basic existence, which is life itself and also love and joy, right? So there's all of those ways of attempting to describe what we would normally label as the ineffable, which is the experience of awareness. Now, no, remember in the beginning when he said, "Why would I?" Um, he said, "Why would I mess around this mental picture?" Because that's the question. The question is, do you assemble a mental picture? And he says, that's the bondage. The assembly of the mental picture is can be the bondage. It's the identification with that ends up being the bondage. So So I think what Nisargadatta is saying here is, no, I don't go around constructing monuments that can be later used as bondage. I think that's what he's trying to point out there, right? He says, since reality is at all times with us, what does self-realization consist of? Right? And he goes, realization is but the opposite of ignorance. He said to take the world as real and oneself as unreal is ignorance. He said, and the cause of sorrow. To know the self as the only reality and all else is temporal and transient is freedom, peace, and joy. It's all very simple. Instead of seeing things as imagined, learn to see them as they are. When you can see everything as it is, you will also see yourself as you are. It's like cleansing a mirror, right? The same mirror that shows you the world as it is will also show you your own face. The thought I am is the polishing cloth. Use it.
Use it.
Right. So think about what the polishing cloth is, right? I am without the identifier, right? Includes all the identifiers. known and unknown, and that's essentially right. Every it's the entirety of the known, and living within the unknown, as we talked about last time. But if you think about it, when you're using the I am as that place, you're stepping out of identification with an identifier and into simply the sense of presence itself with no identifiers. That's the polishing cloth that he's after in this piece. And that's it. That's where he ends in this little run. So so really really interesting how he did that. I think in a page and 3/4, that's probably about as powerful. And that one paragraph
And
is really an incredibly nice piece. Any comments on that? Does somebody want to, did anybody go ahead, Michael?
Um, the only thing I see in here, well, one thing that I get a little confused by is he defines awareness as the primordial, right?
Yeah,
So in Buddhism, it would be emptiness. Emptiness is
yep,
form is emptiness,
yep,
and there's no split between the
yeah.
two. But like the kind of the way that you speak about it
Right.
and the way that Nisargadatta says here, if this is a right translation, it says awareness, there is awareness in every state of consciousness, as if there's a duality there or a split where it even be possible for awareness to be in consciousness, because awareness would be consciousness. There can't be that split there. Otherwise, you've created another duality.
And
No,
I think a
agreed.
better way to say that would be consciousness is in awareness. Awareness is the primordial. Awareness is the only thing that is. And out of that comes consciousness.
Yeah, and
And
that's
consciousness
kind
then,
of a and that's kind of a duality too, because consciousness being in, now you still have
but
one.
understanding that consciousness is the illusion, it doesn't exist in reality. It really doesn't exist. The only thing that exists, if you want to give it the name awareness, there's all kinds of ways that people name that I am that, you know, there's all different ways of saying that, the primordial, the whatever. And from from that primordial um energy, vibration, whatever, didn't even create, right? I mean, there's the confusion, I think, comes in because, how do you say that this was created? Well, it wasn't. You know, it it just it, it's just an illusion. It doesn't
Well,
exist.
and
It's
that's why
not there.
you see us using the term arise. Because
But even that,
I get it, but it's kind of like trying to say appearance without any cause, right? And
right,
what's the word for that? That's and
right.
that's as close as we
And
get on that.
consciousness arises in awareness. If you're using awareness as being the, or as, defining that primordial
Right.
that we are,
How would consciousness arise in awareness?
how does any of it happen?
Well, I
It
mean,
didn't.
Yeah.
It's just because we have our five senses, or we think we do, the we, and we can see things and we can touch things and we can smell things. We think we can do that. We believe we can do that. The experience is for us that happens, that we can do those things. But it isn't any of it real.
I think
And
it's all
that's the
absolutely
confusion.
real. I think it's all absolutely real as the absolute.
It cannot be other than the absolute.
Yeah, that's another way to say it. I think it's interesting because we'll go into Ramesh's piece here, but because he talks about that gulf across which the mind cannot travel. And I think we do a lot of that sometimes is bumping up against that. And so when one takes a look at the fact that what we can do is construct and create a story that we use as a pointer, right, at some point in time. Because even when Michael brought up the term primordial, that's not one of my crazy favorite words. Uh,
No.
and it's very Western, right? I never heard Ramesh ever use that word. Just like that just wasn't a piece of his lexicon. So when I read it in today, or the other day, when I usually read these two or three times, but during the week. But when I read it, I remember looking at that and going, it was kind of a clang for me, because it's not a way that they would describe it. And I notice in I Am That, I run into a few of those here and there, because I think what happens is the translator, very incredible translator, but also very Western in his particular point of view. So you get words, you get these terms, and you're kind of like, well, think about it, Michael. How many times have you and I used the word primordial in a conversation about awakening? Never, right? So you look at that word, and you're kind of like, excuse my French, but oh fuck, what do I do with that? Right? Because I've never even thought about that, or how to frame that, or how to tie that into this particular conversation. I just haven't, right? So the minute Michael brought it up, I'm like, oh yeah, he's going to take me out on that ice patch. Ain't that great? So because that was my first take on seeing that word. I was like, oh great, because but it definitely got used in that particular piece.
Michael, I mean, maybe I'm completely wrong about this, but I think that like one way to conceive of that would be if you thought about it like from a kind of like quantum point of view, like there's just a quantum field, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
There's just a quantum field, but there's appearances on that quantum field that that are forms, but they're not separate from the quantum field. So there's no real duality in there. But the forms develop consciousness because they've created a form that can contain consciousness. The consciousness is empty until it perceives something. So when it perceives something, the mind that's within the consciousness creates an image inside of itself, but that doesn't separate it from being a field of quantum particles.
correct.
So you could
Well,
think of Brahm as being like the field of quantum particles.
well, and it's like Nisargadatta takes it, and Ramesh will
And
both take it back, and they'll talk about the absolute unaware of itself.
Right.
Right? That's where they'll take it all the way back to, which is, yeah, that, I think that's always in play, unless because that's what he talks about, is consciousness is on contact, right? So on contact, that duality gets, triggered, I guess. I don't know what, for lack of a better word, but it doesn't change all of what's there. I used to remember I would struggle so hard and with noumenon and phenomenon, because noumenon was projecting this phenomenon, right? And the phenomenon was definitely identifiable and, definable, and all of those things. And the noumenon, from what I could tell, wasn't. It took me a long time to figure it out. Finally, I was watching this thing about holographs one day, and I went, oh, right, because the projection of the holograph is from a field that's not really identifiable, if you will. There's no images or defined pieces in that projecting. The projector doesn't have that. But I used to really, really struggle with that, because I wanted noumenon to be, if noumenon's projecting this, it must be over there. Well, it is. It's just not identifiable in that particular place. But I struggled. That one drove me nuts for a long, long
yeah,
time.
and Shankara uses the word superimposition, Tanner, to talk about what you just described. And it's
Right.
exactly that I'm after right now to break free from. I think that's a duality, and it's too long of a conversation for here, but I don't think superimposition gets you to non-duality.
Yeah. And of course, well, we don't want to let's leave that,
Go down that rabbit hole.
because now we're going to talk about consciousness as the only capital. which is chapter 2 in Ramesh's book, and
Is that the Pointers book?
yeah.
Okay.
So it's on page 3, right at the very beginning, right? So here, and I was talking to Tanner a little earlier about this. So notice what he does for the ease of speaking. He talks about that which is sentient and that which is not. That by itself is a conversation that can lead you down a rabbit hole you can't believe. So you have to make that piece of difference in order for all of this to make sense in a conversation. So he says he comes out with a statement that consciousness is the only capital that a sentient being is born with. He says this is the apparent position. He said the real situation, however, is that which is born is consciousness, which needs an organism to manifest itself in, and that organism is the physical body. Right. So I think all he's saying here is that consciousness doesn't belong to the body, but rather the body belongs to consciousness. I think that's kind of the little piece he's trying. He says, what is it that gives it sentience? He says, capacity to feel sensations, respond to stimuli to a sentient being. What is it that distinguishes a person who is alive from one that it is dead? He said, it is, of course, the sense of being, the knowledge of being present, consciousness, the activizing spirit, which animates the physical construct of the body. Right? So when he talks about it here, it's a pointer. What he's trying to do is create the focus on the fact that that's the only capital. That's, in other words, to wander elsewhere in terms of one's pursuit within the story, for instance, within causality, within any of these other areas, it ends up in essence being a waste of time. So he focuses on that. So he says it is consciousness that indeed manifests itself in individual forms and gives them apparent existence. In each individual, the absolute gets reflected as awareness. Right? So that's kind of an interesting way. Once again, a lot of times we call it absolute awareness, or we say awareness is actually the deepest place. Here you can see he's using the term absolute. And Ramesh actually liked the term source. So that because that got him out of the on contact. In other words, that was just pure awareness before contact, so to speak. Right. So however you look at it, that's what that is. He says, in each individual, the absolute gets reflected as awareness, and thus pure awareness becomes self-awareness or consciousness. So he's tracking you into that, right? And then he goes on, he said, as different from consciousness, pure awareness, the absolute state, is without beginning and end and without the need of any support other than itself. So what he's pointing out here is that consciousness is dependent, pure awareness is not. And that's where we get into the from where did it arise, that eliminates, which is where Diane was working earlier, was the isness is isness, right? There isn't a way that isness became isness. Isness is isness, so.
That makes me think there's no isness like show isness.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Of course. He says, then he goes on, he says, awareness becomes consciousness only when it has an object to reflect against. And this is when he says, between pure awareness and awareness reflected as consciousness, says Maharaj, there is a gap which the mind cannot cross. Reflection of the sun in a drop of dew is not the sun. So that's where we, that's where you get into the pursuit within the story. When what we're doing is seen as simply story bound, as it were, then the question is, when do you bump up against the ceiling? Right. So the conversation Michael and I might have had, Michael says, I'm pursuing X. I would say, I think that's outside the ceiling. And then who knows, right? But like then because consciousness is going to do what it does. So Michael's on his bicycle pedaling as fast as he can, and that's good. And me, my bicycle's in the garage, and that's the only difference. You know, the consciousness has some of us riding a bicycle, and some of us are done. So
I think the thing that's mystifying to me is that from time to time I get a pretty clear intuitive sense of what it's all about. But the minute I try to put it into words, I can see how the limitations fall apart
yeah,
because they can't encompass that. And like you've always been saying, mesh consciousness, everything. So I'm happy to understand without being able to necessarily put it into words that are classifiable because it's an impossible job.
yeah. I mean, it's funny because uh, within deconstruction in the philosophical world live these people called phenomenologists, right? And I was in that area of study, and I could never quite get like Husserl and Heidegger and all of those folks were in this phenomenology, which was the stripping away of everything until whatever left, right? That their point was whatever left was going to be the reality of what was that probably most phenomenologists right now are fainting, but nonetheless, that's how I'm going to phrase it out. And it was really interesting to me to note that Nisargadatta, um, when you strip away all the phenomena, what's left is nothing, right? So the obvious thing is not to create the something out of nothing, so to speak, right? That's what he was saying earlier. I don't do that. I don't create those structures. Well, that leads one to think that basically, as in meditation, there's just simply a a wordless, silent response to arising, right? And that arising comes and it goes, and that's it. Now, I didn't live in Nisargadatta's body, don't know, but that seems to be a bit of what he's pointing at in terms of when he says see reality, right? Well, what is reality? Reality is just simply is, I am. It's is, and I hate to use that term, but it's just simply the here and now. That's reality. And that's so once stripped down, then the living of it is on the other side of that gap, which the mind can't go. Right. So the mind's not, so obviously he's telling you the mind's not participating in it. Right. That's at least that's how I would explain it for sure. Right. So he goes on, and it's really interesting. Go on to page 5, by the way, if you're tracking it in the book here. Um, he says he often says we can observe nature and the function of consciousness in our daily routine of sleeping, dreaming, and waking states. In deep sleep, consciousness retires to a state of repose, as it were. When consciousness is absent, there is no sense of one's existence or presence, let alone the existence of the world and its inhabitants, or of any ideas of bondage and liberation. Right, so there's that. That's across the gap. He said, this is so because the very concept of I is absent. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. He goes, in the dream state, a speck of consciousness begins to stir. One is not yet fully awake. And then in a split second, in that speck of consciousness is created an entire world of mountains, valleys, rivers, lakes, cities, villages with buildings and people of various ages, including the dreamer himself. And what is important is that the dreamer has no control over what the dream figures are doing. Right. So in a way, given that the case, one could say the difference between dreaming and the state of being awake, as it were, not awakening, but just simply being awake, is that you think you have control of one of those two states, right? Whereas in the dream state, it's pretty clear. He said, in other words, a new living world is created in a split second, fabricated out of memory and imagination, merely by the single movement of that speck of consciousness. Imagine, therefore, says Maharaj, the extraordinary power of consciousness, a mere speck which contain and project an entire universe, right? When the dreamer wakes up, the dream world and the dream figures disappear. So again, when that questioner asked, and I am that, are you creating all of these things? That creation isn't happening in that place, so to speak, right? He says, so what happens when the deep sleep, as also the dream state, are over and consciousness appears again? The immediate sense is that of existence and presence, not the presence of me, but presence as such. That's the I am. That's the cloth he says to use as a polishing cloth, right? And then he goes on to talk about that. He says we're so accustomed to thinking of ourselves as bodies having consciousness. And I think this is where kind of the philosophical world gets in trouble because the consciousness becomes um, a lesser piece than whatever it is they are, which if you read, you'll never discover what that is. No one talks about that. They just talk about you having consciousness. He said, soon, however, the mind takes over and creates the I, concept and awareness, and the body. Right. So actually it's consciousness, that has you. Very interesting. It's kind of interesting because watch how often we have to use assumption in order to do everything that we do. I remember Ramesh once said, he said, yeah, if you took all of the books, he said, that actually had anything that pointed towards truth in them on your desert island when you got, abandoned, he said, hey, you could put those in a suitcase. He said, because the rest of all of our libraries of the world are built on an assumption. He said, well, first of all, just take you. He said, nobody knows what you is. He says, and we spend an entire time trying to establish the you. He said that we try to dissolve in the first time we speak, when we speak of Advaita, right? The first thing we do is, all of that, the entire work of humanity, dissolve. Yeah, get rid of that. Right? So he would always make note of that, and I really enjoyed that. So remember that. He said, so I said that. He said, it's therefore essential to apperceive that birth and death are nothing but the beginning and ending of a stream of movements in consciousness, interpreted as events in space-time. If we can realize that, we shall also realize that we are pure being awareness bliss in our original pristine state, and when in touch with consciousness, we are only the witnessing of and totally apart from the various movements in consciousness. Now he goes on to say, this is an indisputable fact because obviously we cannot be what we perceive. The perceiver must be different than from what he perceives, right? So he's just using that in service of this particular place, which is he always talks about witnessing as being a natural place that is occupied or should, live within us, but that the obfuscation of the individual ego has eliminated that. So when we talk about it, a lot of times it feels like we're extending into the witness. That what we're doing is we're starting from here and we're learning how to be this witness. And what Maharaj is trying to point out is that no, the witness space is actually the natural, not primordial, but the naturally existing state within awakening and within who we are. Right. So we're not crawling into anything. We're not expanding anything. I was saying that earlier about um, I saw leadership. I get these emails. I used to do a lot of leadership work, and it was how to take the pieces and cobble them into a whole. And immediately my mind said, you can't do that. That can't be done,
The
right?
theory of
Because
everything. Yeah.
right, the unbroken whole. It's like the I tell the Humpty Dumpty story. That like if you broke the egg and then you glued all the pieces together, would you have the same egg that you had before? Right? No, because you can see all the cracks in it. It's what it is. It's a bunch of pieces glued together. It's not the unbroken whole that preceded the cracking of the egg. And what we do is we start at where the cracking exists, and we try to walk into the wholeness from there. And actually, it's the dissolution of the cracking that lets the wholeness emerge, and it's always there. Now, notice the one thing I was going to say, there's another thing I wanted to say because we have been talking about that. We've been talking about being lived, right? So think about that. He said, you look at this dream and you go, you're not in control of any. It's just it's lived, right? Well, if you think about awakening as pure relaxation, right? What is more relaxing than understanding that every single thing that happens, right, is simply being lived, right? So if in each activity you can actually go, oh, do I think I'm doing something here? Right? Because the reality is it's happening through you, right? But there's no you that's doing that, right? Which is a state of perfect relaxation. It's available. That's available at any time. The sense of being lived. Go ahead, Diane.
I'll never forget the relief I felt when the realization came for me that there was no such thing as control. And I've said this before on that if control was real, then I would have the control to never be out of control.
Right.
And that's not true. That's not the experience at all.
So
So
I would contend that your relief, I would probably use the word freedom
yeah,
because pure freedom pure freedom in essence is the felt experience when one doesn't stick out of what's actually wanting to happen, you included.
it
Right.
was just like, wow,
Yeah,
okay.
it's really an amazing. Yeah, you said really. I remember thinking that, the first time that kind of phenomenal piece occurred, and it was one of the most profound things. I was like,
And the
whoa.
fact that I cannot be this body
And
because I call it my body. I call
I
it my hands, my feet. I can't own them and be them at the same time.
I remember walking around for days, kind of shaking my head, going, who knew that freedom came from being exactly what it is that consciousness was living you into? That would seem to me to be the antithesis of anything that anybody would deem as freedom in the egoic world that we understand, right? It's like, let me tell you what freedom is. What you do is you give up any notion that you have any control or autonomous capability to do something, right? And you just are lived. And people would say that's bondage, right? And I walked around shaking my head for days. I'm going, who knew that, that
Mhm.
in that arising, that sense, that the sense of freedom and relief.
And I remember you saying that Ramesh would say, or you can look at the videos, the few that we have of Nisargadatta, when he gets very adamant about something and that anger and then he laughs because it's just like because that's just Nisargadatta doing that. It's
Yep.
not, you know,
Yep.
that's just the
Oh,
personality of that particular body mind that's doing that. That's
yeah,
not.
my favorite's a story what he says to them. He goes, "That's the stupidest question I ever heard." And the respondent, who was somebody who came a lot, knew him pretty well, said, "I was thinking the same thing." And everybody busts up. You know, call it whatever you like, friend. Like that. It was that kind of a thing. So what? I asked the stupidest questions ever asked. Obviously, that was my job.
Yeah.
But the capability of feeling lived into arising itself is available at every moment. That was what I was trying to point out, and it's so just recognize that, and all of these are pointers to the same place, right? So for
It is placed.
Ann and I, this sense of relief and freedom was really profound. Other